listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview Tina Davidson. Tina is a classical music composer and the author of Let Your Heart Be Broken, which is her memoir about her interesting life journey. I'm here with Tina Davidson, who is a classical music composer and the author of the memoir, Let Your Heart Be Broken. Tina, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
I am so delighted to be here. Thank you.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I have been a composer of classical music, so I write symphonies and string quartets and music for chorus and operas. I have been doing that for about 45 years, and this year I just published a memoir called Let Your Heart Be Broken, Life and Music from a Classical Composer.
Now, without spoiling too much of your memoir, what is Let Your Heart Be Broken about?
Well, it's about two things. First of all, my somewhat unusual childhood and some of the secrets that I had in my family. And it is also about my composing process. So it's unusual in that the book is short stories of my life, and then alternating chapters of journals about life as an adult. So you actually are going back and forth between time periods, and being a mother, being a single mother, and continuing composing all the time. So it's about both things. And the title is really about what happens when you allow the pain and the hard things in your life to really be there, as opposed to resisting them and pretending they're not there. So everybody has their heart broken at some point, but this is about allowing that in so you can learn to live with it and be with it, and it's not an impediment in your life.
Now, why do you refer to Let Your Heart Be Broken as a memoir and not an autobiography?
Well, an autobiography would be very factual. Like I was born on this day, and it would be more of a progression of the facts of your life. You know, who you lived with, maybe childhood. It would be more all-encompassing. This is much more through a lens of telling people the story of things that have been difficult for me, and also my composing process and how those intersect. So how being an artist was very important for me to challenge myself and really come to terms with some of my life difficulties so I could compose more authentically to who I am. So that's really the difference between memoir and autobiography. Memoir usually has a kind of a point of view or prism that you're looking through, where autobiography is just the facts, ma'am.
Yeah, and I was, a matter of fact, I'm doing on my YouTube channel, the Heartland Author channel, which I don't cross-promote that often, but I'm going to do that here for a moment. And I'm doing kind of a recurring series of videos, kind of infrequently, called Biographies and Beyond, where in one of the videos I did talk about differences between a memoir and an autobiography. And the big one that I mentioned is that a memoir is more narrowly tailored to one aspect of one's life, whereas an autobiography is more of a written listing and description of pretty much every major event in one's own life.
Right, and in chronological order.
Yes. Now, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's correct.
Okay. Now, is Let Your Heart Be Broken self-published or traditionally published?
It's actually a hybrid publication, which is a really interesting option for people. So this is a very young publishing company, and you actually pay for some of the costs. Not all of them. You pay a certain amount. And actually, this particular publishing company, Boyle and Dalton, one of the things that they do is they really carefully curate who they're going to publish. Then they work with you as editors, and then they help you develop a cover. And they don't do the publicity. They don't have the means to do that, but they are, I've been talking to my publisher every week as we're progressing with the publicity. So they're very hands-on. But it's a wonderful and very interesting option for people to think about. And of course, hybrid publishers come in all different shapes and sizes. Some of them are just a vehicle for you to publish your book, and they're pretty hands-off. And some of them don't curate the books that they publish. They just publish whatever comes through their doors. And I think as an author, you'll always want to go with somebody who is really curating what they publish. And if they have a good editing staff, that can be an enormous help.
Yeah, and hybrid publishers, because they're kind of in an ambiguity space between self-publishing and traditional publishing. They can be pretty much anywhere between the two extremes on the spectrum. So any author that's going to go into going to go through a hybrid publisher really needs to do their homework.
Well, honestly, you need to do your homework no matter what. But definitely find out reviews, look carefully to see what kind of books they're publishing. Sometimes it's better to just self-publish, and sometimes it really works well to go with a hybrid publisher. I have been more than delighted. I've been overwhelmed with their encouragement, how much they believe in my book, and the willingness to work extra. So it's been like amazing experience for me.
Now, how long did it take you to write your memoir?
I started writing the book, and this is my debut book, and I have to say, as an aside, it's really doing quite well. I'm really just very excited and pleased at how well it's doing in terms of getting publicity, and just the readers that read it and contact me through email in the middle of the night. But I started writing it about 10 years ago, and then I put it away for maybe 4 or 5 years, thought about it. I was very interested in sort of the overall architecture, how the memoir would work. I was sort of thinking of it, particularly with some of the stories in my childhood, to create almost a thriller. Like you don't know exactly, something is weird, but you don't know what it is, and you kind of find out later. And actually that apparently works really well. People have told me that it's very hard for them to put it down. But I put it away, and then I pulled it out again, and I actually found an editor that would at least give it a read through and tell me what she thought. And then, about 2.5 years ago, I started looking again for a hybrid publisher. I was actually just going to self-publish it. And my sister, who is also an author, a wonderful author, said, I think you should give these publishers another chance. So I did.
Now, what is the biggest difference between how you approach composing music and how you approach writing a memoir?
That's a great question. I think one of the wonderful things about writing music, composing music, is, for me, and I can only speak for myself as a composer, composing is always about who I am and what I am learning about life, like that I'm learning about being a mother or being a single parent or getting remarried, all of that to me always goes into my work. But music is very anonymous. I can write about something that's pretty traumatic in my life, and you might not know. You might say, oh, that's kind of a energetic piece, or that sounds a little angry, but it's really, nobody will ask you, oh, is that about your mother? But writing is much more, especially when you write memoir, and if you want to be really truthful, it's very revealing. So that's one big difference. I love words and I love the musicality of words, and I think I approach writing in that way. So in that sense, there is a similarity.
Now, what was the biggest life-changing event that led you to decide to become a composer?
It wasn't so much life-changing, but I was always a pianist. As a child, I studied piano, and because I was born in the 50s, you did those things much more seriously, I think, than they do today. And so I practiced an hour a day. That was just, what we all were supposed to practice. But by the time I was in high school, I was living abroad in Germany. So I actually went to a conservatory and studied there. And then I spent another year abroad and also was studying piano. So when I got to college, I was a really pretty good pianist. But I didn't realize that women could write music, because at that point I had never played anything by a woman composer. So when I found myself in a composing class, I was kind of surprised and resistant. But after I started writing music, it suddenly became the only thing I wanted to do. It was sort of as if I was looking out into the forest and there are lots of paths through the forest, but only one is illuminated. And I had to do it. I think I was called to discover myself through music and to understand myself through music, but also be anonymous. So that was my draw. So I've been composing for 45 years, mostly as a independent composer. So I wasn't teaching at a university. I was just making my living for many, many years just writing music.
Now, on the list of recommended questions on your Podmatch page, there were a couple of questions that referenced childhood trauma, and I'm going to kind of merge them into one question. What did the childhood trauma you experienced entail, and what was the relationship between your childhood trauma and composing music?
My childhood trauma was that I was born in Sweden and lived there for 3.5 years in a foster family. And one day, a beautiful American professor came and she adopted me and brought me back to the United States. And she got married, and I was the oldest of 5 children, and I was although my mother never distinguished between me and the other children, I always sort of knew in the back of my head that I was adopted. And then when I was 21, I went back to Sweden. I was actually had a job there, babysitting a daughter of a family friend, and went to the adoption agency and found out that my adopted mother was actually my biological mother. And, that was trauma in the sense of who am I and how do I belong? And I had, for 21 years, I had been this adopted child, and suddenly I wasn't. So that was, I think, very much what I was writing in music, that sense of separation, not belonging, and trying to find a sense of being with others. So I think that's, was always the story I was telling through my music for many, many, many years.
One last question I have is, you met the late Ernest Hemingway in person as a child. When you met Ernest Hemingway, did you realize how significant it was to meet him in person?
No, I was only 5, and my parents, my mother and stepfather, had just married, and one of their projects as young literature professors is they were going to go around and meet all these and photograph famous writers. So it was just, another adventure. And, when I look at those pictures that my stepfather took of, this beautiful Ernest Hemingway, and that he committed suicide 4 years later. I'm very sad about that. I also went on to meet Carson McCullers, Carl Sandburg's. They interviewed a lot of really interesting. James Baldwin came to our house to some sort of faculty party. I probably met him in passing. So, and Carl Sandburg, apparently, I was downstairs, I was just 6 at that point. I was sleeping on this little chair, sucking my thumb, and he looked at me. He said, "See how I affect the young ladies these days?" Because I was sound asleep. So, yeah.
Well, Tina, that was my final question. I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, and you were an amazing guest.
Oh, thank you so much, Aaron, for having me. I so have enjoyed this.
Tina was a wonderful guest, and I hope you all read Let Your Heart Be Broken. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.